So now we're going to move on to the intervention by Jane O'Sullivan, who is going to talk to us about facing up to overpopulation. So Dr. Jane O'Sullivan is an honorary senior research fellow at the University of Queensland. She researches demographic impacts on environmental sustainability, food security, and economic development, and the historical and evidential basis for policies and programs responding to population growth. She's going to talk to us today about facing up to overpopulation.
Hi everyone, and thanks for inviting me to speak on this prickly topic of the human population. It's a pleasure to be participating in an event that's not too timid to identify population growth as a key dimension in the many crises that we're facing. In the last couple of decades, a dangerous taboo has developed against attributing any part of our mounting social and environmental problems to population growth. Recently, even organisations formed to address it, like the UNFPA, Population Reference Bureau, or Population Action International, have virtually expunged any reference to population growth as a problem, instead focusing on uncontentious issues that might obliquely influence population growth. There's a particular taboo about the word overpopulation. I've been told that it implies that we intend to kill people off. So let's be clear that what we're all about is trying to prevent a huge die-off of people. Overpopulation is an existential risk. Overrunning our natural resources can only lead to more deaths by starvation, conflict, or disease. And the only alternative to that is a voluntary restraint on the number of human births. It's not a quick fix, so it can't be our only strategy. We must simultaneously limit our environmental impact per person. But if we only focus on the environmental impact per person, we're just delaying the crisis. To choose not to reduce global population is to choose suffering on a vast scale. So what is overpopulation, and how can we say we're overpopulated? It's been defined as a human population so dense as to cause environmental deterioration, an impaired quality of life, or a population crash. This is related to the concept of carrying capacity, defined as the maximum population of a species that an area will support without undergoing deterioration. So a lot of people protest and say it's not too many people, it's too much wastefulness and too little concern about doing things in an environmentally friendly way. That might be true, but it doesn't mean that we're not overpopulated, because our current capacity is based on what we actually do now, not on any future possible behaviours or technologies or institutions. If any single environmental indicator is going backwards due to human pressure, we are by definition overpopulated. The fact that so many of them are going backwards so alarmingly means that our sustainable population is very much lower than it is at the present. So what this chart illustrates is that carrying capacity isn't the maximum number of people who can exist at one time. When we reach carrying capacity, there's no flashing light that says, stop now. We just keep going, consuming more. But we're running down nature's capital in the process, degrading our natural resource base instead of just living off the annual interest of the biocapacity that our environment can support sustainably. The longer we stay in overshoot, the more we erode our resource base and the further the population has to fall before we regain sustainability. So the question is, how do we retreat from overshoot to a sustainable population level? And we can do this in one of two ways. We can reduce our population, or we can increase Earth's carrying capacity. And in both cases, there's a nicer way to go and there's a not so nice way. One problem with choosing just to increase carrying capacity is that it implies less natural resources per person and therefore a lower average quality of life, unless we can increase productivity of those natural resources to an even greater extent. And so far, we've focused very successfully on increasing productivity so that we get more out of each hectare of land, each litre of water, each tonne of copper. And we devise more ways to use lower grade natural resources that we couldn't previously utilise. But increasing carrying capacity doesn't solve the problem, it just defers it. And in the meantime, it causes a lot of collateral damage, appropriating more and more of the natural world and generating more and more wastes. We've reached the point now when the rest of the biosphere is on the brink of collapse. Humans and their livestock now account for 96% of terrestrial mammals, only 4% of wild animals. 2/3 of wild vertebrates have been lost in just the last 50 years. And as we all know, a growing list of species is on the brink of extinction. So why not put more focus on ending and reversing population growth? It's extraordinary that this is such a controversial topic. It's understandable that powerful people who are exploiting other people's cheap labour want more population growth. It's understandable that real estate developers want more population growth. But why do self-proclaimed progressives vilify anyone who identifies population growth as a problem? It turns out that an elaborate set of myths has contrived to make a virtue out of inaction on population. The first is that population is already stabilising by itself due to a precipitous drop in birth rates around the world. The truth is, we're adding as many people to this planet each year as ever. In fact, the 8th billion will probably be the fastest ever, taking less than 12 years. As we see in this chart, global population has been following pretty much a straight line for the past 50 years. There's not yet any indication that it's curving down towards a plateau. In 1968, we had the highest ever growth rate at just over 2% per annum, and now it's only 1.1% per annum. But in 1968, we added 73 million people, and now we're adding well over 80 million people each year. It's a smaller percentage because the total population has more than doubled, but the pace of growth has not slackened. So what about that precipitous drop in birth rates? Well, certainly the fertility rate fell quite steeply in the 1960s and 70s when the West's post-war baby boom ended and family planning programs were adopted in many of the most populous developing countries. But since the population taboo took hold in the mid-1990s, it's tailed off. In the 1970s, global fertility fell by more than 1 child per woman. In the 2010s, it fell by little more than 1/10 of 1 child per woman. At that rate, it will take many more decades for the fertility to reach the replacement level of 2, many decades after that for population momentum to stop the growth of the global population, and centuries to get the population back to a sustainable level. Indeed, we'll be more likely to see a crash through increased deaths in the meantime. We had turned things around in the early 1990s. You can see the pale blue bars are the actual number of births per year. And they started coming down in the early 1990s. But because the number of mothers is increasing at such a rate, even with declining fertility, it's not enough to lower the number of births. And now we have more births per year than ever before. The United Nations population's projections show population growth tapering off by the end of this century. That's the blue line is the UN's medium fertility projection, which is their best guess. The high and low projections are half a child per woman, higher or lower, indicating how much scope there is for different outcomes. But the medium projection still assumes a steady fertility decline in all high fertility countries starting immediately. And the UN admits that this is not a business as usual scenario, that it could require additional substantial efforts to make it possible. So how are we going to commit to those efforts if we're not allowed to name the problem? The second myth is that China is the only country that controlled its population growth, and it took a cruel one-child policy with forced abortions to achieve that. So therefore, anyone who wants action on population is advocating similarly draconian measures and should be lustily denounced by all compassionate people. Well, this is just ignorance of the fact that many countries reduce their fertility just as effectively as China. And this chart shows a number of them. And you can see that the fertility decline started very abruptly, coinciding with the start of their family planning programs. They used only voluntary programs providing services and information to people, but they did actively promote the benefits of choosing small families. And that component is virtually missing from family planning programs today. Note that even China did it under a voluntary program starting in the late 1960s. China's the orange line here, and you can see that by the time the one-child policy came in 1979, the job was nearly done. And in fact, the one-child policy probably only slowed it down by destroying public support for family planning. The next myth is that population growth is due to poverty. Development is the best contraception. This myth is intended to cast all direct efforts to reduce fertility as unnecessary, ineffective, and inappropriate. The problem is it's not true. It's a case of correlation implying causation in the wrong direction. In this chart, the decline in fertility is plotted against the level of wealth of each country. And each dot represents a 5-year period, so there are multiple dots per country. Development as the best contraceptive suggests that the more wealthy developing countries should see greater fertility decline, but it's not so. There is no relationship whatever. The poorest countries could reduce fertility just as fast as middle-income countries if they chose to prioritise it. In the right-hand chart, we see the reverse causation, the change in GDP per capita over 5 years related to the level of fertility at the start of the 5 years. And the relationship is astoundingly strong. With the exception of a few Middle East oil states, countries with fertility above 4 children per woman have simply failed to achieve any development. Once fertility is below 3, countries start to get ahead. And when it's below the replacement level of 2.1, development really kicks in. And this is understandable since population growth diverts a lot of investment and effort away from meeting people's current needs just to build enough infrastructure and provide enough teachers and doctors and everything else to expand provision at a rate of 2 or 3% every year. Most poor countries simply can't keep up. It's like trying to run up a down escalator. If the escalator's going too fast, you end up going backwards. But if you can just slow it down a bit, you start to make headway. The slower it goes, the more benefit you get for the same amount of effort. My next myth is probably dear to the hearts of many of our listeners, so please don't write me off when I say that it's a myth that educating girls is the key to ending population growth. It's another way of saying don't talk about population because indirect approaches work better. A lot of people say it's about educating girls and access to contraception. But again, this excludes the promotion of small families and having open conversations about the benefits of ending population growth. The truth is that girls' education helps, but not much unless there is also family planning effort. And this chart shows sub-Saharan African countries with the size of the dot representing the strength of family planning effort. Programs in Asia were stronger than any of these, but even in Africa, family planning effort has had a much stronger effect on whether women regulate their fertility than their level of education. A good family planning program can reduce the fertility gap between educated and uneducated women. And again, people are ignoring the reverse causation. Girls are more likely to stay in school if they have fewer siblings, if they're not married early, and if they don't get pregnant. All things that family planning programs address. Myth number 5 is that population growth is actually good for the economy. More people means more innovation to solve any issues that we might meet in terms of resource scarcity. What a cruel hoax this is. But it has persuaded many people to believe that family planning programs were never about development at all. They were about a Western neo-colonial attempt to control non-whites by controlling women's bodies. This is widely believed in the women's rights movement, despite being a ludicrous rewriting of history. The family planning movement was always about freeing women to take control of their own lives. When they were recruited to help countries with their population policies, the influence of Western family planning professionals helped ensure that measures should always be voluntary and support freedom of choice. The truth, as we've seen, is that population growth makes people poorer. And it's not just about each generation getting less land, less water, less fish per person. It's also about the economic burden of a rapid population growth rate and the inability to provide sufficient infrastructure. This is true even in resource-rich countries like Australia and Canada that have chosen to pursue rapid population growth for the sake of their economy. So the final myth is levelled at anyone who raises population in relation to environmental crises and climate change. It is that population growth of the poor doesn't matter because their ecological footprints are so low. So even raising the topic of population growth is a callous attempt to blame the poor for your own overconsumption. The truth is that these self-appointed defenders of the poor are directly undermining the single most effective means of helping the poor. In high fertility countries, population growth is a greater threat to security and well-being than is climate change. But it's not just about poor high fertility countries. In all countries, choosing to have one child fewer reduces carbon emissions more than any other choice an individual can make. And this chart shows the average annual saving for people in rich countries from various actions. Having one child fewer is about 70 times more powerful than a plant-based diet, so becoming vegan and not eating meat and dairy products. So why is the environmental virtue of small families not as widely known and promoted as the virtue of eating less meat or of recycling? The fact is that we're massively underinvesting in family planning. Globally, international aid amounts to around $1 billion per year for family planning, which is about what my country, Australia, spends on COVID-19 income support every 3 days. National governments put in another $3 billion roughly, but that's spread over more than 1 billion women. And yet we know that each dollar spent on family planning directly saves several dollars in unneeded health services for mothers and infants. It's costing us money not to spend that money on family planning. And yet every dollar that we spend on family planning would avoid more carbon emissions than any renewable energy technology. And the same dollar saves lives, empowers women, improves food and water security, protects biodiversity, reduces poverty. The list is long. There's really no excuse for not making this our number one best buy for a sustainable future. So what should we be doing? We need to be more outspoken and to denounce the population taboo. And we need to aim for fertility rates much lower than 2 in all countries. Don't let our governments get away with convincing us that we need to boost fertility to save us from the terrible implications of population ageing, because there's a whole bunch of other myths that I could debunk about that particular non-problem. And yet countries fear population ageing more than they fear climate change. And finally, we need to celebrate depopulation wherever it occurs or is anticipated to occur. There are so many good outcomes from population decline. We should not tolerate the gloom and the panic that the media invariably attaches to it. So my time's just about up, and Thank you for listening, and I really look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Jane, for this extremely interesting talk. Would you mind turning on your camera, and I will ask you a couple of questions. Oh, here you are. And can you now say a few words? Oh, excellent. Your microphone is also on. Fantastic.
Hi, Alba.
Hi, Jane. Thank you so much for joining. So I found that your diagram that I think James is about to show was really interesting. And I would like to ask you a couple of more questions about it. So you show here a decline in consumption in the future. So past the overshoot to the right. And I was wondering, what would that be related to, this decline? Or is it a decline? It seems to be a decline in consumption, but is it also a decline in population, perhaps?
Almost certainly at that point where the decline in consumption is forced by inadequacy of our natural resource base, it would involve a population decline. So you're talking about a major catastrophe, a collapse of civilization and a simplification of our societies. That's really the situation that we want to avoid desperately. And the only way to do that is to have a managed decline rather than a collapse.
Of course, that's what I suspected this showed. I just wanted to make it explicit here.
So that's not consumption per person, that's consumption in
overall,
aggregate.
Yeah.
The number of people multiplied by their needs and what they draw from the environment.
It reminds me of something that David Attenborough said, which is, if humans do not decide to take care of overpopulation themselves, nature will take care of it for them. So we're basically trying to manage the problem we've created by taking care of it ourselves before the circumstances escape us, I suppose. On this diagram, you also have like a really interesting thing, which says there's no Big Bang. So when we reach our maximum carrying capacity and transition into overshoot, so do you think we've passed that threshold yet? And what would be a sustainable population level?
Absolutely, we passed it a long time ago. The Global Footprint Network estimates that we did that in about 1970. I have some issues with the way they calculate it, and I think from a perspective of defining the optimum human population as one that also allows the flourishing of other ecosystems that aren't human managed, I think that we probably passed that point a long time before that. So there have been various estimates of a sustainable global population, and I think probably the upper limit of the plausible ones is about 3 billion people. Lower limits are below 1 billion people. So really, to me, that isn't the interesting question, because that's not relevant to the decisions we need to make in the near term. The decisions we need to make are about slowing and reversing our population growth as fast as we can. When we stop the decline is a decision for a future generation, not for our generation. But what we can do is try to minimize that area under the curve in the overshoot area, which is the damage that we're doing to our natural resource base and to the rest of the species that share this planet with us.
Really interesting. And below the graph, you also have a table, which I also found really interesting. I think Julian's talk was just about perhaps the preferred way of increasing carrying capacity through means of increasing productivity. So do you think increasing food productivity in a sustainable way, in the way that Julian described, would that stave off the need to address overpopulation for a while, or do we need to address both in parallel?
My personal opinion is that we need to address population first and foremost. People will generate enough food for the people that are there if it's physically possible for them to do so, because that's, that is really critical to the functioning of society. And we have been focusing a lot on increasing agricultural productivity. But what the important part of Julian's reframing of that is around minimising the damage and even reversing the damage that we're doing to land and water resources in the process of making food. Unfortunately, to minimise that damage in a lot of contexts means producing less food from those areas. But there's the capacity to shift our diets as well, to eat less meat and to take some of those grazing lands out of production and divert some of that arable land from producing food for animals to producing food for humans. And these are really not about technology, they're about the economics of markets. That it is more profitable to grow soybeans to feed cattle than it is to grow the staple foods that are needed in West Africa, for instance, which is becoming a great big importer of food because it has more people than they can support there. So if we just focus on the productivity of food, we will keep increasing the population, and we have diminishing returns on that focus. Our main staples, particularly wheat and rice, are sort of plateauing off in their yields because we've done all the easy things that there is to do to maximise their productivity. So we just start hitting more and more walls when we're just focusing on production of food. We're using way more water than is sustainable. And the implications of that, considering that a great proportion of the increase in food production in the last couple of decades has been through the expansion of irrigation, the implications of having to use less water are huge. So we need all of those new technologies to grow food in different ways in order to make up for what we're going to lose from those free resources that we've been overutilizing from the rest of the environment. But the biggest risk aversion that we can do is to peak the human population at the lowest possible level we can and as soon as possible. And to accept and welcome a relatively rapid decline, even though that will mean a relatively older age structure of the population. And that is not the problem that we are told it is. It really is a non-problem. But we need to embrace it and accept it and understand it and enjoy all of the things that population decline will bring.
I think that's an excellent segue into my next question, which is, why do you think the media always portrays population decline in such an alarmist way, and what can be done about it?
I'm not sure what makes people panic about it so much. I think that there's an innate drive to reproduce in humans, and that there's this instant tendency to extrapolate any decline as being, the harbinger of human extinction. That as soon as Japan's population started to decline a bit, somebody calculated the year in which the last Japanese person would die. It's as if we don't have any option to do anything else in the intervening period. It's really beyond rational thought. So I really don't know how to answer it, other than that it does benefit some of the most powerful people. And we need to understand that those people are farming people. And they have convinced us that what's good for them is good for the rest of us. And that's a big fat lie. What's good for them is not good for the rest of us. And it never has been. So if we are able to reassert our democracy, and that's getting harder and harder with the power of big business, then we should be able to say, no, we don't want that sort of world. We don't want a world where the aggregate GDP and the value of shares is the only thing we care about. What's in the interests of growing our economy is not in the interests of the well-being of people now or in the future.
Thank you. And I think the last question, I'm going to tie back to the address by Professor Naidu and by Paul Ehrlich yesterday. So Professor Naidu introduced us to the risks posed by soil contamination and ocean contamination by chemicals. And Paul also talked about plummeting sperm counts in his address. So do you think that these trends that we're seeing will have an impact on human fertility, and which impact, and will it be fast enough to ensure that we don't destroy the planet with our numbers?
I think chemical contamination has a lot of very important impacts on human health, but I am not at all concerned about human fertility. And I don't think we can depend on that to reduce population growth. It fascinates me how a reduction in sperm count makes headline news, you know, when it really doesn't affect the quality of life of anybody and very rarely affects their ability to achieve the family size that they want. You know, it's really, yes, it might indicate a problem we need to address, but compared with the scale of the crises that we have in so many other dimensions, it's just really weird how, and quite sort of misogynist, how interested the global media is in sperm counts when they're so disinterested in many of the health issues that affect women. But what we need to realize is that people can produce way more children than needed to replace themselves, even under very challenging circumstances. And, you know, West Africa is an example of that, where husbands and wives are often separated because husbands go away for work or go away herding stock. Women are often iron deficient or zinc deficient, badly nourished generally, that lowers their fertility. They do a lot of hard work in high temperatures, you know, involving heat stress, and that's meant to lower fertility. All of these things that are bad for human fertility, and yet they're producing 7 children per woman on average, you know. So our biological fertility is almost irrelevant to our realized fertility in terms of how many children per person we have. The only way to limit the population, other than by more deaths, is by choosing small families and choosing to use modern contraception to achieve that.
Excellent. I think that's a really good place to end. Thank you so much for your intervention, Dr. Sullivan.